On today's episode of Locked On Wild, a successful season for the Minnesota Wild has got to feature a little better in the depth department.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
Hey, this is Marcus Foligno, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, we are your team each and every day. We thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day as well. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we'll take a look at three things that Bill Guerin needs to keep in mind this season and areas that he is certainly going to have to be ready to address. We'll talk about the potential to navigate injuries and deadline deals as well. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild, credentialed media member for the 2025-2026 season, and host of Seth on Sports as well. And we talked about what John Hynes is going to need to do this season and this big topic of, those veteran security blankets versus potential for youth to make a big impact on the roster this year. And kind of a similar theme for Bill Guerin this upcoming season as well. I want to just go through with you some of the names that we saw play in games for the Minnesota Wild this past season. A lot of injuries, although as we found out, the Wild's nowhere near the top of the list as far as injury games lost this past season. Even though it seems like they should have been. They were upper third, but not really close to the top 10 or even the top 5. But just look at some of these that we saw from this past season. So obviously, as far as trade deadline acquisitions went, Gustav Nyquist, Justin Brazeau. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the Wild had 55 games from Devon Shore, who was not initially on the roster, but was brought up to fill some injury needs. Brendan Gaunce played in 12 games. Ben Jones played in 26. 3 games for Reese Johnson. 3 games for Travis Boyd. 9 games for Travis Dermott. And Vinny Hinostroza was a waiver claim. 25 games from him, although I'm going to put him not in the category that I'm referring to at this current moment, because I think people were relatively surprised by what Vinny brought to the lineup when he worked his way in. But in the 55 games that Devon Shore played for the Minnesota Wild, mostly fourth line role with the injuries, you got a total of 5 points in that span. You had a total of 5 points in those 55 games. And in the 55 games, you had a total of 41 shots on goal. And we just spent a large majority of the John Hynes episode talking about the potential for people to just be passengers on this roster and how you really can't afford to have a lot of those guys. You just can't. And so having Devon Shore, you got 26 quite literally 26 pointless games from Ben Jones and 24 shots on goal in that span. You got 3 pointless games from Reese Johnson, from Travis Boyd. You got a 1 point spell from Brendan Gaunce, who played in 12 games. Had just the 1 point, 11 shots on goal. My point being here is that injuries are going to happen. You are not going to get through the lineup with 6 defensemen and 12 forwards. We've already seen that with Matt Zuccarello out to start the season. Jonas Brodin expected to miss at least the first couple games of the season. And the number of players that you had that were regulars that played under 70 games, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 of your regulars played fewer than 60 games. You're going to have injuries. And you need to be ready to fill those spots with players that can give you a little something. Otherwise, you are just like filling time. You're filling bodies. You're just trying to fill up. You're trying to fill up a plane with a couple of passengers just to fill the spots. You can't afford to have those empty calorie minutes. And I know that your fourth line is not expected to be nearly as high a producing line as, say, your second line is. But the last couple of years, especially, the Wild have had many instances in which they are throwing some clearly AHL caliber players on the ice. Let's look at what the Wild got 2 years ago. You had Jake Lucchini playing 40 games, and he had 5 points and 22 shots in that span. You had the likes of, I know Pat Maroon was one of the big acquisitions before the 2023-2024 season. You had Vinny Lettieri playing 46 games. You had just a whole bunch of guys that just didn't really give you a ton. And depending on how the lineup plays out this year, there is a potential for your lineup to feature. Now, I saw in one instance a projected lineup that featured Danila Yurov, Joel Eriksson Ek, and Vladimir Tarasenko. And I know that was utilized in the game against the Jets for a good portion of the middle frame, just to kind of try it out, just to see if Yurov was able to hang with those two. Liam Ohgren, it's expected, is going to be the starter in that spot to start the year, unless we go back to the Johansson second line operation spot. But it's expected that you are going to have a third line of likely Danila Yurov, Ryan Hartman, and somebody else, Johansson or otherwise. If Marcus Foligno does not play on that line, your fourth line likely this year is Marcus Foligno, Nico Sturm, and Yakov Trenyan, which is leagues better than what the Wild have had over the past few seasons. Those are bona fide NHL players. And that is a line combination that it may be more on the physicality side, more of kind of the quick change of puck possession side, but they can give you something. And every line that you have that features players that are kind of in over their head, that just subtracts from what they can bring to the ice, and it puts more pressure on the other portions of the lineup. So having quality, capable depth is a massive part of the equation, and it's one that you are going to definitely have to rely on as the season goes forward. Now, we did see earlier today that Brett Leason was released from his PTO. He didn't really pop here, so it's not a tremendous shock that he was allowed to pursue other opportunities. Sounds like he's headed over to Europe. Not a huge loss there. It just didn't really stand out in a training camp, and that's the whole point of those PTOs, is to stand out and maybe put yourself in position to win a job. He just didn't do it, so you cut bait and you move on. But we know Hunter Haight has played very well in the preseason. So depending on how the injury situation plays out, I would imagine that he will be in line for some opportunities, depending on how things arise. But there are some other names that, if they clear waivers, could also factor in that I think are just at a much better spot than the Wild have been the last couple of seasons. We'll take a look at that depth that the Wild currently have as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel has an offer you don't want to miss. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. Just pick a bet, put down $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. The Minnesota Vikings are taking on the Cleveland Browns this weekend. They open as 3.5-point favorites, although I would imagine that line has moved due to the news that the Browns are looking heavily into a quarterback change. So what you could do is use your $5 on the Vikings minus 3.5, and then you just split the winnings between the Vikings winning the NFC North, which is currently plus 1,000, and the Vikings to be the first Minnesota team since 1991 to win, at least on the male side, to win their championship. They are plus 5,500 in that regard. That'd be some pretty good money if both of those hit. But regardless of what you choose and how you choose it, you can head to FanDuel.com to get things started. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today and get started. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Once again, we thank those of you that have subscribed to YouTube, up over 3,600 now, and continuing our climb as we get closer and closer to the start of the season. So if you haven't joined in yet, make sure to do so. We have a lot of fun with it, and trust me, the fun is just beginning. So we're talking about navigating injuries. The Wild have suffered a ton of them over the last couple of seasons, and the depth has been so-so. Now, Tyler Pitlick, Nicholas Abe Kubel, Hunter Haight, I think are probably the three leaders, maybe Ben Jones, probably the leaders in the clubhouse to vault into your lineup if you suffer some forward injuries that require you to go long stretches without key pieces. But I think, at least on the side of Pitlick and Abe Kubel, and probably Ben Jones, those are fourth line replacements. They're not higher up in the lineup replacements to fill top six roles, top line roles. So then this is where kind of the second layer of this approach comes into play. We've been clamoring for Liam Ohgren to get an opportunity for quite some time, and looks like he's going to get one because of the Matt Zuccarello injury. If you were to suffer another injury in your top six, that leads to an opportunity for Danila Yurov to slot in and to step up to get an opportunity there. That's how you have to play this, because those guys that I mentioned, they are better NHLers. They're at least former NHLers to the point that they, have something to give, as opposed to, especially when Jujhar Khaira was signed as NHL depth. He played in one game and that was it. You have to have capable depth that can fill in at the NHL level. But I think the Wild are in a good position to promote from within with players that are showing that they are ready to handle elevated roles. And on the Hunter Haight side of things, as a young player that is still getting his first taste of NHL action, yeah, maybe he's somebody that you would start that low in the lineup and kind of work your way up. But the point being that he has shown in the preseason that he is not daunted by by playing at the NHL level, at least at this point. So I think, although I have been wrong on this the last 2 seasons, so maybe I should just not fall for it again. It seems like the depth is better, but it seems like the ability to fill and to elevate is in a much better spot this year than it's been in previous seasons. Now, on the defensive side of the ice, obviously the 2 big names that you have that can fill in for injury are David Jiricek and Carson Lambos. Those are the 2 real big ones to this point. Depending on how long Jonas Brodin is out, that could lead to us seeing David Jiricek get an extended stay. I really don't know what to expect with this Jack Johnson thing. He's looked decent, but are you going to really carry him on the roster? I could see it. I would maybe prefer it not. And I don't know if it's something that he's going to want to be sitting on the bench for a large majority of the time this season. Alex Goligoski was pretty vocal about the fact that he wasn't a huge fan of that during his final season. He would much rather have been playing. So maybe you don't end up bringing Johnson with, and you hope that Zach Bogosian can be kind of that 7th defenseman that slots in a pinch. Again, depth-wise, Lambos has looked really good in the preseason. He did look really good in the preseason before he was sent back down to Iowa. And Jiricek is somewhere in between at this point. So he is another one that can slot in. And, of course, the goaltending depth. We've talked about Cal Peterson. He's actually played a little bit in this preseason, and he's done fine. He's done what you would expect from a 30-year-old goalie who was with the Kings for a while, and the results just never really popped. So he left the Kings organization, went to the Flyers, and is just trying to find his way back to the NHL at this point. I have concerns, though. Now, Jesper played against the Jets. He looked good, I thought. So it seems like he's getting more comfortable with being an NHLer. But if for some reason you were going to try to go into the season with Cal Peterson as your backup, I think you were asking for a whole heap of trouble. Can he be the backup for a stretch if somebody's injured? Sure. He could handle it for a spell. But if you're going into the season with him as your backup, I'm not on board with that. Organizational depth, yes, but if he were to beat out Jesper, that's not going to fly. I don't think that's the case at this point. Jesper continues to look comfortable and in control. He had some big saves down the stretch in that game against the Jets. So it looks like he's ready to take that opportunity. So your depth is hopefully better, and you are in position to be able to navigate. This is the other big piece of this, is you're in position now to be able to have roster flexibility. The Wild going into the season with everything now factored in, according to Puckpedia, they have $5.1 million in cap space. So you have the ability to move players up and down the roster as needed. Now, you want to try to accumulate as much cap space as you can, so that once we get to the trade deadline, you can take some steps to improve the team if they are in position to be contending. So that's kind of the other piece of this. Biggest piece will be obviously Bill Guerin trying to navigate the injuries, keep the roster afloat with some of the depth that he has acquired. The other big piece of this is going to be, what do you do at the deadline? Because Denny's hit on this quite a bit lately, and he's absolutely right. The deadline acquisitions have been massively underwhelming lately. We'll talk about why that is and why I think we can be hopeful that things will improve, considering what was just pulled off the books. So we'll talk about navigating the trade deadline and pulling in the big acquisition to improve the team as one of Bill Guerin's primary tasks this year. That's on the way as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Again, make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. So navigating injuries, being able to shuttle players between the AHL and the big club, navigating the trade market as well. Gustav Nyquist, Justin Brazeau, and just on down the list. Pat Maroon. Bogosian, I think, has been fine, but, Ryan Reeves, that didn't work out. Nick Delorier, that didn't work out. Bill Guerin has been looking for, almost continually, he's been looking for bottom six depth at each trade deadline. He has pulled some gems out of his pocket. The Capo Kakin and Jake Middleton trade was a good one. But for the most part, he's been operating on a shoestring budget to try to improve the team over the last few years while being able to still have enough room to move players up and down the roster. And this year, I've thrown this out a few times, so I'll mention it again. Puckpedia, if the Minnesota Wild do not make any moves between now and the trade deadline, they would accumulate $23 million in acquirable cap space. Cap space that they could fill with a couple of big players. Now, I don't think that they clearly will make moves up to the trade deadline. But you start with about $5 million right now. And let's say you have 10, 11, 12 to play with at the deadline. That can get you a nice something for the rest of this season and maybe beyond. That's a nice amount to work with to be able to make some nice moves to accent, to put finishing touches on the roster, depending on where you're at in your process when we get to the trade deadline. So that's going to be, I think, the primary charge for Bill Guerin this year is if this team is in contention, now you can flat out go and get something. And the Wild still have their 2026 first round pick, 2027, 2028. They're a little low on the second round picks. They don't have the 2026 or 2027 second round picks. You do have the second in 2028. You have draft picks available. You have prospects available. You have whatever you need to go get somebody to throw into this team to make a major splash, to fill lineup voids, to bolster the lineup. Anyone that you would acquire that profiles as a top 6 player bumps everybody down in the lineup a little bit to deepen things. So that's, I think, going to be one of his big charges this year is if the team is in position to make a little bit of a run this year and somebody's out there that can really help you, go get them. Go get them. That's going to be that's going to be the number one method to the madness this year for the Minnesota Wild. The other thing that I want to talk about is the Iowa Wild a little bit. I know we read the letter from Greg Cronin yesterday, talking about, what he wants to do for this team, wants to get him back to the postseason. Anybody else get the feeling last year that the communication from Iowa to Minnesota was not super great? Didn't seem like it was happening regularly. That can't be the case this year. Now that the big mission of the offseason is complete, with Kirill Kaprizov in the fold for the foreseeable future, I would just like to see a little more unified conversation between Iowa and Minnesota, where the prospects are at, what Iowa needs to facilitate team improvement this year. Cronin he's been around the block plenty. He has coached at many different levels, so I don't worry about him as much as just making sure that Iowa's on the same page with what's going on in Minnesota. And that includes the Iowa Heartlanders as well. If you're going to have a successful organization, you need to have kind of that unified branding from top to bottom. Here's how we do things at the NHL level. Here's what the AHL players should be working on. Here's what the ECHL players should be working on. All the way up and down the list. One of the themes that Cronin talked about in his introductory press conference was visible development. I am hoping to, at some point during the early part of the season, ask this question legitimately. But I take that to mean tangible signs of progress, to where you're seeing players actually kind of start to get things and start to pick things up, put them together, and show actual signs of improvement, and signs of development, and signs of the talent that we know is down on that roster. But it just, over the last couple of years, it just has not been readily available for us to see. And you put yourself in position as well. I mentioned those guys that are most likely to be called up if the Minnesota Wild face another rash of injuries. There's no reason that there couldn't be other players on the list that get looks if they're playing really well. Riley Haight is going to be at the Iowa level, I would assume, this year. Let's say he has a really good stint. You can give him a small sample size to fill in for somebody for injury, just to see kind of where he's at in his process. Rasmus Kumpalainen is another one. If you can get the development going for those guys, you give yourself way more options to fill whatever you need, whatever hole you have on your roster. You've got guys that you can then plug into to fill those voids. And on the defensive side, in addition to Carson Lambos, we're getting closer on Kyle Masters, David Spacek, as guys that maybe get an opportunity depending on who's hurt and what side of the ice you need to fill. Visible development, tangible signs of progress. And so in addition to trying to make sure that the NHL club is poised for success, let's get that organizational messaging from the top down. Let's line that up and make sure that we are best serving those Iowa kids with exactly what is needed for them to make the jump, as opposed to just kind of figuring it out as we go. And I think we'll see more of that from Cronin. I think he'll come in with a plan. I think he already has put a pretty good plan together. And it's all going to be about trying to facilitate and elevate those prospects to get them to the NHL level. We've been talking about many of these players for years, and we're going to get a real good look this year as to if it was just a matter of the voice that was telling them what to do, or if it's on the players themselves and they're just not going to develop like we had hoped. We'll find all that out here this year. And my hope is that Bill Guerin is able to really hone in on what should Iowa be doing. Great question. Let's talk about it. Just get those kids ready. Get those kids ready so your depth is better than it has been over the last few seasons. That is going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. We've got you covered with new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.